Call Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Goff is a nice man, but he just can't win at the next election. So said the Honourable Chris Carter just last week and once or twice over the weekend. Mr Goff is a nice man, but he just can't win at the next election. So said the Honourable Chris Carter just last week. I think the Honourable David Cunliffe thinks Mr Goff is a nice man, but he just can't win at the next election. And for members who missed it, Mr Cunliffe gave a speech on the letter T earlier on, and I think he's the last person to give a speech on the letter T, and he's on very slippery ground if he tries that one. I won't go any further.
Order.
Order. Excuse me.
Now, barracking's okay. Lower the tone. I have difficulty hearing the member on his feet. Craig Foss.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think Mr Parker thinks Mr Goff is a very nice man, but he just can't win at the next election. And it's very interesting to watch the arm wrestle between Mr Parker, the Honourable David Parker, and Mr Cunliffe on the finance portfolio. Because did you note the finance question today was in the name of Mr Parker? And do you note on Q&A a while ago that Mr Goff did not endorse Mr Cunliffe? In fact, he endorsed Mr Parker, Mr Mallard and Marion Street, actually, as finance people. He conveniently forgot Mr Cunliffe. I wonder, Mr Speaker, the factions are obvious to us now. The Honourable Bill English earlier talked about it. The copybook's been followed to the letter on the other side. Yeah, we've been there, done that, and you're starting to follow it through. But I wondered, Mr Speaker, who the various factions are supporting. The feminist faction? Well, I think they think Mr Goff is a nice man, but he just can't win at the next election. And I reckon they'll be backing Marion Street. I think they'll be backing Marion Street. But I don't know what member the Rainbow faction are backing. Will they be backing their own member? But I think the Rainbow faction think Mr Goff is a nice man but won't win at the next election. The lefty faction coalition over there, the union side, well, actually, it's pretty obvious they think, and he thinks, Mr Little is the man. He's not even in caucus or in Parliament yet, and he thinks it's pretty obvious Mr Goff is a nice man, but he can't win at the next election. The righty faction, I think this is where Mr Goff's support does come from, but there's not too many sensible people over there, but truth be told, I think they also think, when they look in the mirror, even Mr Honourable Phil Goff himself thinks he is a nice man, but probably can't win at the next election. The Maori faction, Honourable Parakura, I'm sure you back Mr Jonesy, Mr Shane Jones at least, the Honourable Shane Jones, and you also, that faction, Mr Speaker, think Mr Goff is a nice man, but probably cannot win at the next election. And Mr Jones, I understand he joined the blue team, so he should be sitting over here anyway. Mr Speaker, there's probably many Labor candidates out there who have been selected and they're going to work hard at the next election, etc. Well, I just want to tell them something. In 2001, I was selected and we were polling around 33% in 2001. And then there were some issues that spilled out into the public arena. Then it all broke loose. There was infighting. There were speeches at conferences. There were leaks from caucus. It all turned to custard. And as the record shows, National did not perform very well at all at the election. We ended up something like 22% on the party vote. Mr Speaker, the copybook has been followed to the letter from the other side so far. So far we're seeing it, and I'm interested to hear other speakers talk about the faction and, in fact, who they are supporting, because as we all know, and it's repeated time and time again from an honourable member, the Honourable Chris Carter, Mr Goff is a nice man but cannot win at the next election. Mr Speaker, this is a celebration, the third reading of the appropriation debate, an absolute celebration, Mr Speaker, third reading of the budget, the estimates and the reports back here. 25 years of the most fundamental tax reform we've seen, 25 years it's taken to get this kind of tax reform into this country, through this House. We've been waiting 25 years, the hardest of the last 9 years of that particular government, when they were government over there, Mr Speaker. 25 years, a $4 billion investment in New Zealand families, a $4 billion investment in freedom of choice about how families spend their own money, whether they pay off their mortgage, which does not attract GST, whether they save those funds at a 20-cent tax rate, Mr Speaker, or do they choose to spend it, that's right, part of the tax switch, you're quite right, to the member opposite. Balance, fairness is back. By the way, they've forgotten over there to talk about the compensation part of GST. If we recall, when Labor increased it from 10 to 12 0.5% without any compensation whatsoever, and now they're crying poor. Well, funny old game, Mr Speaker. Nine long years, the tax take increased, fiscal drag pumped up by prolific and relentless spending by the previous government, pulled 20% of the New Zealand population, PAYE payers, into the top marginal tax rate. They promised 5% in 1999, they got it to 20%. Funnily enough, they're talking that 5% again. Keep an eye on them, because we know from previous speeches they want to bring in a capital gains tax. They want to do something about LAQCs, but they didn't do anything about those for 9 years as the property boom absolutely took those up, and Mr Speaker, watch them. But what they talk about plans, well, let's just talk about plans of recent past, shall we say. Plans, not action. The knowledge wave, what happened? Remember the knowledge wave, what happened? Top half of the OECD, what happened? We slipped down under the Labor government. We slipped down under their so-called plan. Closing the gaps, do you remember that one? More poor, more reports from the UN, and now we're dealing with that legacy. Carbon neutral, do you remember that one, Mr Speaker? Carbon neutral, 50,000 hectares of deforestation that happened of that plan. Economic transformation, what happened to that one, Mr Speaker? We went from a robust economy to a total disaster. Economic transformation. To be fair, they did transform the economy to actually a pile of custard. For example, the Kiwi Rail purchase we had to take on and ride off. Here's another example. There's plenty of them, Mr Speaker. Sovereign yachts, remember that classic? That was part of their economic development. So when the beakers over there start going on about plans versus action, well, Mr Speaker, I'm more than happy to line up what we've achieved in 20 months from this particular budget, and only 20 months what we've achieved in the 9 years of the crowd over there, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, they get up and talk about monetary policy solutions. Well, the Honourable Damien Connor is going where no other economist fears to tread, I believe, because many experts have studied this. They haven't come up with anything different. But Mr Cunliffe, Mr Parker, Ms Street and Mr O'Connor apparently are going to do something which central bankers around the world have failed after years and years of examining and studying monetary policy. Will be interesting, and I will always note they did in fact sign off and agree to no changes to monetary policy in the inquiry that Dr Cullen, under their watch, put in place at FEC last 2008, and they all agreed. So I can't work it out, Mr Speaker. I'm also surprised, once again, and saddened, that the Labor Party, if they were ever to reclaim the Treasury benches, are going to rip up the cycleway. It's so disappointing. It's so disappointing. I challenge members to get up and say they support the cycleway and they will not rip them up, because that's what the rhetoric from the other side is coming over. Mr Speaker, the government's economic growth agenda, it's rolling out, and it's rolling out fast. Personal tax reform, most reform in 25 years. New highways, Hawke's Bay Southern Expressway extension. Resource management reforms. Supermarkets getting approvals in 4 months, previous government 12 years for a similar. Ultra-fast broadband, $1.5 billion over 10 years, Mr Speaker. National standard in literacy and numeracy. Well, to be fair, the Honourable Chris Carter, his printing, shall we say, was very legible, so he probably did pretty well, Mr Speaker. Sorting out Canterbury irrigation, 19 years, no plans whatsoever. We get in, do the job, start to charge towards a more productive New Zealand. Trade negotiations, Mr Grosser working very hard around the world, and Mr Cully. Welfare focus that works. Employment law reforms, we still don't know where the other side stand on that, particularly buying back the 4 weeks. Andrew Little, who wants to be in here, is pulling all the strings, does not want it. Honourable Phil Goff said he does want it. So please, some clarity from the other side, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, this is a celebration, this third reading. It is an absolute pleasure to be up speaking to the third reading, a budget, some estimates which bring in discipline, transparency and the most fundamental tax reform New Zealand's seen in over 25 years, Mr Speaker.
I